Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our second keynote speaker of the conference, someone I'm very excited about. This is Professor Emily Bender. She is, I love this title, so I'm going to include it. She is Howard and Frances Nostrand Endowed Professor of Linguistics at the University of Washington. That's the longest title. It's so cool. And she also holds an adjunct position at the Department of Computer Science. And I mention these because I think these two positions reflects her diverse skill set and actually is indicative of the expertise she'll be talking to us today about. So Emily's research focuses on many topics that I think are quite dear to cognitive scientists, like the structure and diversity of human languages, the deep syntactic and semantic commonalities and differences between them, and how language can be captured computationally. But she's also emerged recently as one of the premier scientists today who are thinking about issues surrounding the rise of AI, especially the increasing prominence of large language models like GPT-3. And her work there addresses fundamental questions both scientifically and ethically. So on the scientific side, questions like what are the similarities and differences between how these models and humans learn, how they process and represent language, and how they think, with think in quotes. But also equally important, if not more so, is on the ethical and moral side. What are the implications of our increasing reliance on AI as we construct a society that depends on the decisions and inferences these systems make, especially given that a lot of times these decisions and inferences might not be things we understand or incorporate biases we're not aware of? So these are important issues, and of the many people who think about them, in my opinion, Professor Bender is one of the most thoughtful, moral, and clear thinkers about them. So since they have such profound ramifications for both cognitive science as a field and our world as a whole, I'm really pleased to welcome her to share some of her thoughts. Professor Emily Bender.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. It's delightful to be here. Fingers crossed that this is going to work. Do we have slides?
What's a tech talk without tech issues? It should
be
in 1 second.
We saw this working before, so we believe, we know you can do it, technology.
What?
Foreshadowing a bit what the talk is going to be about. The technology doesn't care that I know it can do it.
Oops, sorry. What's happening?
Okay, let's see the desktop first. Could be the PowerPoint.
God is laughing at us. Yeah.
So thinking now.
You want the other laptop?
Wait.
Yes.
Clap.
Okay.
Everybody
Hit
clap.
play.
Everybody clap.
All right, here we go. Just in time for those of you just entering. Thank you, Andy, for the delightful introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the people who are joining online. It is my pleasure to get to speak to this broad audience. I have put my slides up at this link. That link will persist on the first couple of slides. The real reason I want you to have that is that it's got a bibliography at the end. So as I talk about other people's work, you'll be able to find it. Also, if you're on Twitter, I hope you are already following me or find my contributions at least worthwhile. My handle's there on the bottom, and if you were inspired to tweet remarks about this talk, I would actually appreciate that. So my title is Resisting Dehumanization in the Age of AI. And what I'm going to do here is talk about some ways in which so-called AI research, development, and sales involves dehumanization. This gives you the quick list. I'm going to go through them in detail and then come back to this at the end. And then I'm going to talk about the ways in which cognitive scientists are well positioned to resist this dehumanization and the many roles that we have to play. And again, I have 6 different points that I'll go through in turn. And I'm doing this on the basis of what I've been doing as a linguist. And I think it's fair to say that linguists are a kind of cognitive scientist. And I hope that my experience will generalize. So as a roadmap, I'm going to start by telling you who I am and how I came to this topic. and then give you a working definition of dehumanization, because that seemed important, and then go through those two sets of 6 things. So what are the kinds of dehumanization that I see in AI research, development, and sales, and then what cognitive scientists can do about it. Here's your last chance at grabbing the slides if you want them now, but that'll come back on the last slide too. Okay, so who am I and why am I talking about this? My training is in linguistics. I did a PhD in syntax and sociolinguistics. My earlier degrees are also in linguistics. I teach in a linguistics department. I'm a linguist. I have quite a bit of years of experience now at this point with multilingual grammar engineering. That is building grammars in software across many languages. I work on a multilingual grammar engineering project called the Grammar Matrix. So far, we've mostly worked on spoken languages. More recently, since about 2016, I have gotten interested in the societal impact of language technology, and in particular, so understanding what kinds of things can go wrong, and then thinking about how we can support researchers in considering those societal impacts in research, also in development, also in education. What can we do? And that has led me to be part of a broader conversation about identifying and mitigating harms that are done in the name of AI. So that is how I come to this topic sort of generally. More specifically, there's a path that runs through a couple of recent papers of mine. The first one was with Alexander Kohler in 2020, and we called it Climbing Towards NLU, that's Natural Language Understanding, on Meaning, Form, and Understanding in the Age of Data. And that paper was written in reaction to widespread claims that language models, that is, systems trained to predict strings based on other strings, either leading up to the predicted string or around it, claims that those things actually understand language, which it was pretty clear to us that they don't for theoretical reasons. And what those have to do with are the fact that language is a system of signs. That is, words and phrases are pairings of form and meaning. This goes back at least to de Saussure. And language models, so things like GPT-3, are just trained on the task of string prediction. That is, their training data only has form. They don't have the meaning side of it. So if it's not in the training data, how could it possibly be learned? Furthermore, you get these comparisons to child language acquisition, which are quite misleading, where people will say, my machine is learning just like a kid does, when we know that child language learning is socially rich and it is socially situated. That is, you learn in interaction with other people doing intersubjectivity. In this paper, we have a thought experiment involving an octopus that we posit to be hyper-intelligent. So the question is not whether or not it's intelligent, but whether it could actually learn a human language, in this case, English as encoded in Morse code, given access only to the form of that language. And we showed that, in fact, it can't. All it can learn are patterns in the form. So that was a paper in 2020. In 2021, together with Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell and Angelina McMillan-Major, as well as additional co-authors at Google who were not allowed to keep their names on the paper, somewhat famously. We wrote the Stochastic Parrots paper, and this paper was inspired by the observation that there was this trend already very evident in 2020 towards ever larger language models, and nobody seemed to be asking, wait a minute, what could go wrong here? So that's what we did in that paper. I mean, not nobody. The people in charge, the people who were driving that, didn't seem to be asking that question. So we looked across the literature at the possible risks associated with language models and what paths might be available for mitigating those risks. We looked at environmental costs of this technology, and in particular through the lens of environmental racism. We looked at financial costs and their impact on research participation when that becomes the main go-to way of doing this kind of work. We looked at the ways in which the data sets collected are filled with hegemonic viewpoints and worse, with no or minimal documentation or accountability for what's in that data set. And we looked at how synthetic text generating machines can cause problems. So not only in their creation, but also in their use. On the one hand, they can reproduce the systems of oppression that they learn from those data sets. And on the other hand, they can mislead humans who are very primed to make sense of text when we encounter it. One of the things that happened in writing these two papers, I had maybe hoped to stop having interminable Twitter arguments about whether or not language models understand. That didn't happen. But now they take on a new flavor, and I get asked, how do I know that you're not just a stochastic parrot? And after being asked this a couple times, I decided I am not going to have conversations with people who will not posit my humanity as a basic axiom of the conversation. And once I phrased it that way, I thought, it could be really useful to think about dehumanization across AI. And then I realized how much it says about the privilege that I experienced, that it took that for me to have that realization. But this is how I came to this topic. All right, so to define dehumanization, there's a broad and deep and somewhat discontinuous literature on dehumanization that I have only scratched the surface of. I'm going to use these two definitions as sort of touch points to come up with one that's a good working definition for my purposes. But there may well be a better definition out there in the literature that I haven't found, or there may be better sources for the one that I came to. So I just want to flag that I'm way outside my home research area in doing this reading. So there's a book by Feldner, an edited volume about dehumanization, and in the preface she writes, "Dehumanization happens when people are depicted, regarded, or treated as not human or less human." And then she says that's a thin definition because there's relatively little agreement across the literature as to what exactly is dehumanization. So that's one starting point. The other starting point is a book by Wahilier on racialization and racism, in which he writes, "If racialization is understood not as a biological or cultural descriptor, but as a conglomerate of socio-political relations that discipline humanity into full humans, not quite humans, and non-humans, then blackness designates a changing system of unequal power structures that apportion and delimit which humans can lay claim to full human status and which humans cannot." And there I think that is written very much through the lens of someone who has experienced racism and seen how it connects to perceptions of full humanity and otherwise. So from those two starting points, I came to this working definition that has three parts because I think it's important to acknowledge both the cognitive process of the person doing the dehumanization, the acts that express it, and then the experience of being the target of it. So dehumanization, for my purposes, includes a cognitive state of failing to perceive another human as fully human, acts or sort of systems and bureaucracies, et cetera, that express that cognitive state or otherwise entail the assertion that another human is not fully human, and then thirdly, the experience of being subjected to those acts that express lack of perception of one's humanity and or deny human experience or human rights. Now there's a key phrase in here which also needs defining, and that's fully human, which for my purposes are entitled to all rights recognized as human rights, equally in possession of internal life and point of view, and welcomed and known as one's full self. Because I think part of dehumanization is when you have to leave part of your identity at the door to enter a space that is also dehumanizing. So these are the serious issues that I'm working at, and now I'm going to make the case that a lot of the work in AI is actually perpetuating this. So dehumanization in the research, development, and sales of so-called AI. The first of these 6 ideas is a wonderful paper by Barria and Cross from last year looking at the computational metaphor. And the computational metaphor, this is a paper by neuroscientists for neuroscientists. And they talk in the first instance about how this is a scientific metaphor that is used and debated in neuroscience, and it goes in the direction of the brain as a computer. And the idea is that scientifically that might help in shaping neuroscience research. But it's also a bidirectional metaphor, and the other half of it, the computer as a brain, is used as PR by technologists. And what Barria and Cross have to say about this is, first of all, this metaphor affords the human mind less complexity than is owed, and the computer more wisdom than is due. So it's basically building up computers at the expense of how we understand humans. Furthermore, they talk about how this metaphor rests on other well-ingrained ideologies in which a hierarchy of human value is tied to a particular notion of intelligence, such that the quality of being emotional is considered inferior to being rational, and also allows us to create hierarchies of humans related to the extent to which they take on these more machine-like qualities in their intelligence. And so they say at the end of the second quote here, according to this logic, in its fakeness as a human intelligence, AI paradoxically succeeds in being a more trustworthy form of intelligence by being the epitome of rational thought. And then they have this wonderful quote from Dijkstra from 1985. So this is not a new conversation, right? Back in 85, Dijkstra observed that there was together with this tendency to talk about machines in anthropomorphic terms, he says, the companion phenomenon of talking about people in mechanistic terminology. And then he observes literature in computer-assisted learning, where in the eyes of their authors, the educational process is simply reduced to a caricature, something like the building up of conditional reflexes. For those educationalists, Pavlov's dog adequately captures the essence of mankind, while I can assure you, he says, from intimate observations that it only captures a minute fraction of what is involved in being a dog. Love that quote too much to skip it. But there's a really serious point here, which is if we view computers as a model of the brain in one direction or the other, we are missing a tremendous amount of what it is to be human. All right, my second example of dehumanization in AI are cases where technologists appropriate the experiences of disabled people to assert the humanity of AI. And I see this frequently. Again, Twitter dialogues where people want to talk about how language models are maybe like blind people. All right, but there's a particularly elaborated version of it in a blog post by Blaise Aguirre-Arcas, where he asserts that large language models are like deafblind people. And one part of this is under the heading of modality chauvinism. He calls on the writings of Daniel Kish, who's blind, and Helen Keller, who's deafblind, to argue that, that's a fun little recursion, no one sensory system is required for humans to develop concepts. Okay, fair, that's true, but that doesn't mean that large language models are doing that, right? He can't show that large language models are like people with internal lives and relationships and full personhood. And so as a result, he ends up dehumanizing blind and deafblind people by saying that they are like something that is patently not human, specifically because of their disability. And I have a longer response to his points. That's what this other link is about here, if you're curious about that. All right, third point is what's called digital physiognomy. Physiognomy is the classification of people into identity categories based on their physical characteristics, in this case, as observed by computer vision, either photos or videos, or things like voice signals. And we have literature now that claims to predict criminality, sexual orientation, employability, political leanings, psychopathy, and lots of other things based on photos, videos, voice samples, all right? And I want to point out that classifying people by things like gender or race based on how they look is equally problematic. And it's problematic because this is flattening human identities and emotional experiences into ideas that these things might be intrinsic and externally observable categories of classification. So what's happened here is that the pseudoscience of physiognomy, which was discredited, has come back and been re-given this veneer of objectivity through the application of computers. And this also a blog post by Aguirre-Arcas together with Meg Mitchell and, I'm sorry, I don't remember Todorov's first name, does a very nice explication of it, as does the Stark and Hudson article that's cited there. Lost my train of thought, except to say that this is a pseudoscience. It's got this false veneer of objectivity, here it is, and it is weirdly popular. Like, these applications keep popping up, no matter how many times people say, hey, that's a bad idea, it's not gonna work, it's fake, and it's gonna do harm. It keeps happening, which is really frustrating. All right, point, I think we're on 4, is what I'm calling ground lies. This has to do with the way the data sets that are used in training AI are collected and then understood. They are mythologized as being representative because of their size and because of their lack of curation. The idea is somehow, oh, this was just out there in the world, therefore it's naturally occurring and a true representation of things. When in fact, there are decisions at every point, at least where to collect the data from, how to collect it, how to filter it, what labels to apply, who should apply the labels, and how the labels are verified, and more, all right? It has been well established, these articles and others, that if we don't actively work to curate the data sets that we want, then we will be collecting data sets that are representative of dehumanizing ideologies like white supremacy, and therefore building in another kind of dehumanization into the AI systems. There's a wonderful essay by Deb Raji that I'm quoting from here that appeared in the MIT Tech Review at the end of 2020, where she says, data sets so specifically built in and for white spaces represent the constructed reality, not the natural one. To have accuracy calculated in the absence of my lived experience, and she's writing as a Black woman, not only offends me, but also puts me in real danger. Highly recommend this essay. All right, point, I think 5, maybe I've lost count, is irrelationality. And here my point is that humans are not just social, but actually thoroughly relational in our experience of ourselves and our lives and our world. There's a nice and dense piece by Kisello where she argues that the self never just is, but rather emerges continuously and jointly, relying on behavior and action and on doing and being together with others. And she also talks about the importance of intersubjectivity. So our very selves emerge in relation to the world and to each other. And Abeba Birhane, in an article called Algorithmic Injustice, a Relational Ethics Approach, says, humans are inherently historical, social, cultural, gendered, politicized, and contextualized organisms. Accordingly, their knowing and understanding of the world around them necessarily takes place through their respective lenses. So not only are ourselves relational, but our knowledge is relational, and it is based on how we fit into the world and how we experience the world. I wanted to remind myself to say, I have learned that sometimes this emphasis on relations and things social has been used to dehumanize neuroatypical people because they experience relationships differently. And so it is really important that our definitions here are broad enough to capture different ways of being in relationship. The knowing, in quotes and scare quotes, that we program into scare quotes AI is irrelational. So Birhane again, data science and data practices reincarnate rationalism in many forms, including the manner in which the dominant view is taken as the God's eye view. So the computer has the objective, true view on the world. It is somehow better able to see that, right? So it doesn't have relational knowledge. It has supposedly irrelational knowledge. And machines just aren't designed to be in relationships with people or to jointly make meaning with people or to apply what Scott called an I can't guess what the pronunciation of this is. It looks like the French word métis, but there's no accent. So anyway, métis, métis, I don't know. And this is the way in which a person working with a set of rules faced with a particular situation that they have to handle via those rules can creatively apply them or bend them or navigate through them based on the facts on the ground. And computers can't do that. It is just hard rules or whatever comes out of the statistics. We aren't going to understand through the relationship of what's going on how to actually apply this wisely. All right, so irrationality as a whole ends up devaluing humanity while also leaving no space for it. So Sarah Roberts writes that dehumanized and anonymous decision-making done by computers in a way that mimics but replaces that of human actors is somehow perceived as more just or more fair. It is better for the machine to make these supposedly impartial decisions that are not in relation with anybody, which is wishful thinking, right? We know that humans are biased. We know we don't always make good decisions, but that doesn't mean that computers are making better ones, right? So that is devaluing what humans can do, and at the same time, creating a world that doesn't leave room for our humanity. And there's a wonderful essay by Ali Al-Khatib on, it's called To Live in Their Utopias, where the there is either AI systems or the designers of those AI systems. And he writes, damage manifests most profoundly not only when errors get made, but when people are compelled to endure those errors. Absurdity follows when algorithmic systems deny the people they mistreat the status to lodge complaints, let alone the power to repair, resist, or escape the world that these systems create. In other words, when algorithmic systems try to insist that they, people, live in their, computers, utopias. So we have a situation where humanity is not valued, and then in fact it is not respected. There's no space for us. There's no space to be different. There's no space to have different needs. All right, next point is ghost work. And this is humans as hidden software components. I strongly recommend the book by Gray and Surrey called Ghost Work with some subtitle. And here the point is that actually human effort is everywhere in so-called AI systems, in labeling of data, in designing systems, in evaluating systems, and then finally as a backstop for when the computer doesn't know what to do and the task gets shipped off to a micro worker working on a crowdsourcing platform. Using those platforms, tech firms hide the labor and the humanity of those micro workers in systems that are designed to produce the illusion of AI. And here, think about things like the content moderation on social media platforms, where you have people in sweatshops going through and tagging stuff as in or out according to sets of rules, or in their own living rooms or whatever, doing this as micro work. Similarly, the platforms that make the crowd work possible hide the humanity of the micro workers from the requesters by basically encapsulating them in worker IDs, so you just see a number, and treating them as interchangeable. They are basically software components that can be called through an API. So all of this is very dehumanizing to the people doing the work. And then finally, I lost count in there somewhere. This is number 6. The whole discourse around AI also reinforces the white racial frame. And there's a paper by Cave and Dehal, 2020, called The Whiteness of AI. And they are speaking about what's going on within Anglo-Western culture, where they see that AI is racialized as white. So robots are depicted frequently, or physical ones are made frequently, with literal white exteriors, like in this photograph. And the more humanoid robots are designed to be perceived as belonging to the white category in our racial frame. And even if you have a robot that does not have physicality to it, if it's a text-based chatbot or a virtual assistant, they talk white. All right? And this goes back all the way to ELIZA. So Marino 2014 observes that Weizenbaum's ELIZA, which is from the 1960s, used white language features, white American English language features. And Siri, which was released in 2011, didn't get African American voices until 2021. So these things are racialized as white. And Cave and Dehal have 3 hypotheses for why that might be. One is the disproportionately white workforce in AI. We have a lack of diversity, and people might be designing things based on their experience of what's around them in the world. But also, the traits that are associated with AI, so intelligence, professionalism, power, are those that the white racial frame ascribes to white people. And so that sort of reinforces this notion that, of course, the AI is white, because it is intelligent, it is professional, and it has power. And they write, the whiteness of the machines allows the white utopian imagination to fully exclude people of color. So this is a third idea where people designing AI, white people designing AI, are trying to design a set of servants that work for them that would allow them to not at all interact with people who aren't white. This is problematic, I mean, on the face of it problematic, but it is dehumanizing because the white racial frame itself is dehumanizing to anybody who is not ascribed whiteness. And so anything that is reinforcing that white racial frame is doing additional dehumanization in the world. And this connects back to Wahilie's notion of racialization and what blackness means. All right, that's all kind of a bummer, but I'm not here just to bring you down, but also to talk about what we can do about this. And this next part of the talk gets very self-referential because I'm going to be talking about what I've been doing as a linguist and it's things that I hope will generalize. So the first thing is we can problematize simplified tasks. A lot of work in machine learning is driven by tasks, which are meant to illustrate capabilities. And a task is something that can be defined either intentionally or extensionally. So the intentional definition is basically an informal description of what the algorithm is supposed to do. So maybe it's a translation from Thai to Navajo, or maybe it is a transcription of spoken Kinyarwanda from the audio signal to text. Or, and more frequently, they can be defined extensionally. That is, through a data set of paired inputs and outputs that the machine is supposed to be able to replicate. Given the inputs, you should give these outputs. Capability is something that's a bit more vague and a bit more general, but the idea is that it is hypothesized to underlie the possibility of doing the task. So for example, the tasks inside the superglue benchmark are meant to illustrate the capability of understanding. Though because many of these tasks lack construct validity, we don't actually know that the ability to do the task on the part of a computer means that it's got the capability that we assume it has because a human would use that capability to do the task. All right, why am I telling you about this? Because I think we can do something about it, but I have to tell you a little bit about the culture of computer science here. I am not a sociologist of science, so these are observations just based on a linguist dealing with computer scientists over my career. There's an emphasis on problem solving in computer science, which is frequently motivated by the expense of human experts. If you read the intro to CS papers, especially machine learning papers, it's like, we have to do this because it's too expensive to get humans to do it. Usually in my field, those humans are the linguists. I'm like, no, just pay linguists. It's okay. Also in the culture of machine learning, there's this idea that solutions should be general, and it's bad to look at the data. You don't want to create something that only works for that specific data. The way that you ensure it is you don't look at the data at all, all right? Which means you're not going to be understanding the shape of the problem, even as an outsider. There's also a partial division of labor between the data set producers, who do look at the data, at least some, and the algorithm builders. Although oftentimes you'll get people who produce the data set, they'll give the first pass approach to it, but then other people come in and try to solve, quote unquote, that task. So the result of all this is wild overclaims that get repeated and amplified in the media of computers surpassing humans at tasks like natural language understanding. And you might think I'm making it up, but check this out. Microsoft's AI model has outperformed humans in natural language understanding. All right, where did that come from? Okay, that's a journalist. Here's the Microsoft research blog that apparently triggered that news article. Microsoft Roberta surpasses human performance on the superglue benchmark. A little bit more staid, all right? But if you're writing for a popular audience, you have to go figure out, well, what's superglue benchmark? And in that same blog, they say, to get the right answer, the model needs to understand the causal relationship between the premise and those plausible options. So they are asserting understanding here, and the journalist just put it together in the headline. All right, so what's this got to do with you all here at CogSci? Well, cognitive scientists are the domain experts in many of the tasks that AI is supposedly doing, many of the capabilities that AI supposedly has. So we may not have asked for this job, but we unfortunately have a job to do here, which is to say, no, that's not how it works, all right? And that's what Alexander Kohler and I did in our 2020 paper. We said, no, language models are not understanding, and here's how we know that. And then in a paper led by Deb Raji, we talked about the ways that claims of general language understanding or general visual understanding are unsupported and problematic in ML. And I think that everybody here who's working on things that humans do with our cognition can probably find something where the folks doing machine learning are making spurious claims. And you're in a position to say that's not how that actually works. Once we've done that, we end up building up skills that allow us to critically examine claims of AI capabilities, which there's unfortunately an unending supply of, especially in the news media. So here's a bit about that. It's kind of a hobby of mine to do this on Twitter. So here's a New York Times article, Can AI-driven voice analysis help identify mental disorders? All right, no, at least not the way they say in this article. Another one, this headline was actually originally, Algorithm predicts crime in US cities before it happens. And then I complained about it loudly enough on Twitter that they changed the headline to Algorithm complains to predict crime. So now my tweet looks like this. It's still an irresponsible headline, and also algorithms don't claim anything, so it's wrong. So when you see one of these things, as you've gotten in the habit of taking apart claims of AI researchers, and I'm not saying all AI researchers do this, but a lot of them do, and those are the ones that the media picks up, you can say, okay, how is this task defined? What's the input? What's the output? Is there any reason to believe that the input provides sufficient information to produce accurate output? Like, is that a possible thing in the world? Where did the training data come from that they use, and how was it validated? Who benefits from assuming that the output's actually accurate? And can this technology be used for surveillance, harassment, or otherwise denying people their rights? This set of questions I found is really powerful for going in and doing critical reading of this kind of news coverage. And then I say ideally out loud, because I turn around and I ask the questions on Twitter, and to the extent that I can answer them, I answer them on Twitter, and I feel like that is helping deflate the hype a little bit. So one thing that I got to here, and this had to do with that, can you diagnose mental health based on voice recordings? And speaking of, like, what are the bad applications here? It's really easy to get a bit of a recording of somebody's voice. If you have a machine that purports to diagnose mental health issues based on voice samples, imagine the trouble you can cause somebody by saying, my machine says you're depressed, or, right? It's a bad idea. So I came to this on Twitter. We are squarely in the machine learning techno-solutionism danger zone, where it's established that it would be really beneficial to have something that can do X with only Y input, right? There are certainly cases where it would be useful to give people accurate, actionable mental health information based on a diagnosis that came only from their voice. Yeah, that would be useful, especially if you could, like, control that weird surveillance application of it. But we haven't established that it's actually possible to do X with Y input. And the reason this is particularly a danger zone for machine learning tech solutionism, or as Meredith Broussard has it, tech chauvinism, is that you can always train a machine learning system that takes elements of Y as input and gives elements of X as output, and therefore looks like it's doing the thing. But if you don't have a good way to actually evaluate and validate it, then it's fake, it's snake oil. But if people are hyping it as I can go from X to Y, then it might get applied. And that is scary and worth pushing back on. Another way that it's important to critically analyze the claims of AI capabilities is looking for the people in the system, right? These systems that are supposedly just AI. And so there's a really nice essay by Lanier and Weil in Wired, where it's called Opinion, AI is an ideology, not a technology, where they say a clear alternative to AI, that is using the term AI, is to focus on the people present in the system. If a program is able to distinguish cats from dogs, don't talk about how a machine is learning to see. Instead, talk about how people contributed examples in order to define the visual qualities distinguishing cats from dogs in a rigorous way for the first time. There's always a second way to conceive of any situation in which AI is purported. This matters because the AI way of thinking can distract from the responsibility of humans. And here I don't think they're talking primarily about the crowd workers who are hired to label the dogs and the cats in the images, but rather the people who designed the system and decided how to use it. There are people there who need to be held accountable and asked, why is this a safe thing to do? Why did you frame the task this way? Who is it benefiting? And so on. All right, another thing we can do, which we should be doing in our research anyway, but it's important in pushing back against the dehumanization in AI, is decentering whiteness or weirds or English. And one way to do this is to insist on specificity. So there's something that's now called the Bender rule. I didn't name it that, but once it got named, I ran with it, which is to always specify the language you are studying in linguistic and computational linguistic studies. Even if it's English, especially if it's English, and that's because people were going around saying natural language when they meant English. And so at NACL 2019, I just made a pest of myself after lots of talks, and I said, excuse me, what language was this about? People said, English. And then people named the Bender rule, and I'm like, I'm happy for my name to be used that way because that's a weird, face-threatening question to ask. And so if it's easier to ask by blaming it on me, go for it, all right? But the broader point is, if we don't name English when we're working on it, if we don't name white people, if we don't name Western society, if we don't name middle and upper class people when we're working on them, then we end up in this situation where the results on those specific groups are misinterpreted as general, and the results on other specific groups are specific to those groups. And it messes up our research, and it also contributes to this general white racial frame that's causing problems. Similarly, we should insist on success criteria that don't leave the concerns of minoritized people as an afterthought or a nice to have. And this goes back to the papers by Raji and Burhani that I've cited earlier. That is, your system is not accurate if it's not accurate for everybody, and it doesn't matter if most of the people who encounter the system or most of the people in the training data are white. If it is failing on the non-white people, it is failing. And we need to insist on that. And then finally, we can question the entire metaphor of artificial intelligence for how it aligns intelligence with whiteness and for how it devalues cognitive capabilities that are outside of those prized by rationality. And we should keep doing that. All right. We should also be advocating for a broader distribution of research funds. I'm going to come out and say it. Computer science is overfunded, and it is suffering from overfunding, and that is particularly true of the subfield of machine learning / AI. Part of what's going on is that there's a lot of industry funds, and then for some reason, national research support is following the industry funds, and so it's all ending up in the same place. And then we have too many people who are all researching the same thing. And I'm not saying those people shouldn't all be researchers. I'm saying they should spread out a bit in terms of what they're researching. And that's not going to happen, I don't think, until we fix the way funding is allocated. It's bad for the people who are doing the research because they find themselves in a situation where the pace is impossible. There's too much being published. You can't keep up. It's bad for the research field itself because you end up with people rushing to try to be the first one to come up with an idea, and things are not sufficiently evaluated, both in terms of the evaluations within papers and the evaluations of papers. It's bad for computer science narrowly because of the neglect of alternative research paths, and it's bad for science more generally because of the neglect of alternative research paths, and because of the power imbalance that we get between computer science and then the domain areas that computer science should be partnering with. And one particularly stark example of this is that there's a funding scheme where it's money from Amazon channeled through the US National Science Foundation to do like a fairness in AI funding thing, and they want it to be interdisciplinary. That's one of the requirements, but the PI has to be affiliated with the computer science department. And it's like, well, so you're basically saying computer science decorated with some other stuff, when if you're asking questions about fairness of this technology, the core research area, the core scholarship area required to answer those questions isn't necessarily computer science. So I would like to see a world where we have as much research funding in general as we have now, if not more, but it is spread out more equitably across the fields, and where computer science has to basically make nice with the other fields to get access to that funding, instead of the other way around. All right. I want to add that large language models are especially problematic in this set of events because they provide the illusion of very general systems. They can generate seemingly coherent text, especially in English, where we have the largest data sets and the largest models, on a very wide variety of topics, right? You can converse with these things on just about anything. And so it seems like they are solving lots of problems that they aren't, or that they are capable of doing things that they aren't. And so on the one hand, their reach exceeds their grasp. The generated text is untethered from any model of the domain. And so if you're going to try to build a system, for example, in a health application, you can get it to give you answers, but with no guarantee that those answers are any good, right? And people are now starting to evaluate the truthfulness of language models. It's like, that shouldn't be a thing where you're happy with anything less than 100%, right? But it's like, oh, look, we did better. Our thing went up 2 points. I don't like that. But also, their reach exceeds our grasp, and I see people inventing tasks without clear use cases, which means that we are not able to evaluate the performance of the systems on those tasks, really, or determine safety parameters. And there's this wonderful phrase from Talat et al. 22, just at, I think it was ACL, maybe NACL, where they say unsafe at any accuracy. And they're talking in particular about a system that was automating morality judgments. And it's unsafe at any accuracy because, like, why would you build that, right? The accuracy is only measured over how well it did on its own data set, and it doesn't matter how high the number gets. That's not a sensible thing to do to put out into the world as a machine learning system. And I think that can apply to a lot of these tasks. So we should be envisioning alternative pro-human research paths that I think do make better use of our resources. At present, AI research is throwing tremendous resources at essentially made-up problems, right? Automating morality judgments, for example. And I want to point out that these resources are not just financial or time resources of people, but also things like carbon budget and other natural resources. This is not just abstract things, it's real concrete material effects in the world. 100 billion parameter models trained on enormous data sets aren't actually naturally occurring phenomena that we should seek to understand because they're out there, like the universe is out there, or like that mountain is there to climb. They are human-designed and created artifacts, and we can choose whether or not to build them. What I would rather see is that we are identifying practical problems that could benefit from computational solutions, and this is instead of finding machine learning solutions that could benefit from problems. And identifying scientific questions, say in the cognitive sciences, that could be elucidated with machine learning or other computational techniques, and then directing the effort there, rather than just building large models and seeing what they do. So what can we do as cognitive scientists? Well, we can engage in the ongoing discussion of ethical considerations and broader impacts. This is starting to gain more traction in the machine learning conferences and in computational linguistics. And I think cognitive scientists are particularly well positioned to see the people involved, both research participants and then other people who are going to interact with and be impacted by the technology. And so we have a role to play in helping to shape that conversation. And then finally, I want to advocate for engaging in public scholarship. AI has absolutely captured the public imagination, probably helped along by decades of science fiction. And the tech firms selling AI are riding on that to push the shape of the regulatory landscape, both in terms of asserting claims to data and the digital world, as very compellingly documented in Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, and also in selling surveillance technology and other deeply problematic applications of AI, saying, well, this is a normal thing, a good thing for governments to buy and use. We can't get to sensible regulation that would address this without an informed public and without informed policymakers. And that's where we, as cognitive scientists, have a role to play in doing some of that informing. So you can do it on Twitter. And And just a couple of quick words of advice for how to do that if you want to. One thing is start by learning on Twitter, so cultivate a set of accounts to follow, especially people who experience different forms of oppression from what you've experienced. And build a network of people who are speaking out about similar things, because this is scary and you get pushback, and it can be very helpful to have someone that you can back channel with and offer mutual support and help understand how to handle things that have come your way. And then be prepared to say the same thing over and over again in many ways, because that's what this is. It's not new research, it's reaching out to new audiences. And I just want to say it's also fine to not do Twitter. It's not for everyone, and I get that. For my own personal trajectory, it's been beneficial, and it's what's actually led me to connections to the news media. And that's been interesting, so a few words on that. I think it is an impactful way to do public scholarship. One thing is, I learned you don't actually have to take all media requests that come your way, and they come in like with surprising urgency. Can you comment on this tonight? Well, no, sorry, I'm doing other things tonight. But it can be very valuable to take some. It can be worthwhile to see if your institution has media training. And then when you get these requests coming in, if you have time, if you like the question being asked, the next thing to do is to check previous work by the journalist that's contacting you. Are they handling these topics well? If so, go for it. If not, you can say no still. You can also ask to fact-check direct quotes. It's a point of journalistic ethics that the sources don't get to read the whole piece before it goes out, but journalists will typically send you, here's what I'm quoting you as saying, and you can make sure they've got it right, especially if you were, if the interview happened as audio. But I also had that happen, an interview by email, and they were trying to like take a half of a sentence that I said that very much changed the meaning, and I pushed back, and it was improved. Another thing is, once you start getting contacted by the media, you might get contacted about things that are not in your area of expertise. So I got contacted after making noise on Twitter about that crime prediction thing to speak to the media about that, and it's like, no, I'm not the person you want to talk to. That doesn't sit in my expertise as a linguist. Go talk to somebody who understands something about over-policing and mass incarceration. And I think that as we engage with the media, it's really important to keep a sense of where our expertise is and speak from that expertise. And then, just like on Twitter, be prepared to say the same thing over and over again in many ways, because it's not about doing new research, it's about educating new audiences. One more thing on public scholarship, I see I'm running out of time, is even if you're not doing the public scholarship yourself, it is really important to hold space for other people who are, because the academy is still struggling to recognize public scholarship as scholarship, and that includes broad engagement with the media, as well as specific engagement with the communities that our research is ostensibly serving. So if you have somebody who's going up for tenure in your department, or that you're writing a tenure letter for, or that you're considering grant funding to, any of those positions of power, it is worth valuing public scholarship. All right. So almost done here. Here's my summary. I hope to have convinced you that AI research, development, and sales involves dehumanization on many levels, from the computational metaphor to the weird current fascination with digital physiognomy, to our ground lies, in quotes, irrelationality, the way we hide work by actual people as ghost work, and the way in which it reinforces the white racial frame. And that as cognitive scientists, we are well positioned to resist this dehumanization, and we have many roles to play. We can problematize simplified tasks that have to do with our domain expertise. We can use those skills to critically analyze claims of AI capabilities. We can and should work to decenter whiteness and weirds in English. We can advocate for broader distribution of research funds. We can envision alternative pro-human development paths, and we can engage in and support public scholarship. Thank you. There's the slides again. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking. I'm going to do the question and answers the same way as the last keynote. So if you are here and you have a question, please line up behind one of the microphones. I think while everyone is heading over, I'll ask, there have been a load of questions in the chat which we can't get to, but I'll ask one of them, which is asking about what role you think AI safety can do in rehumanizing AI and addressing some of the problems you've been talking about.
Thank you. That's a good question. I don't know if people could see the face Andy was making when he said AI safety, but AI safety is unfortunately an umbrella that brings together a couple of very different things. So there's some work under AI safety which is like concerned with weird fantasies of the future where we have actual independent, autonomous, intelligent agents and trying to make sure that they are safe for humans and putting lots of resources into that weird fantasy future, I don't think that's very helpful. You might also, under AI safety, think about how do you shape something so that it works well in its actual application context, keeping in mind all of the people who might be impacted by it. And that strikes me as very valuable.
Hi. Regarding the idea that the brain as computer metaphor is dehumanizing, so if you define computer maybe as like a laptop or cell phone, I kind of see that. But if you use a more general definition like Alan Turing's universal machine, or like David Deutsch, the founder of quantum computing, he calls us universal understanders or universal constructors. Basically the idea that anything a brain can do, a Turing machine can do, and vice versa. In order to keep the distinction, you need to, I guess, define humans by their substrate, and isn't that also problematic?
So I don't agree that we know that anything a brain can do, a Turing machine can do. We have not seen that, nor vice versa. So I think we disagree on a fundamental premise there. I think you can probably define, and this is actually in the Barry-Cross paper, you can define a sufficiently general concept so that brains and computers both fit under it. But that's when people talk about this, especially in public, and you say a computer, we're thinking about a cell phone or a laptop or something like that, or even a supercomputer. They don't do what brains do.
Yeah, I think it's still debated, like whether brains are universal Turing machines or whether there's something more than that. But assuming it was the case, then how would that change?
So assuming it was the case, we'd be in a very different world. So universal Turing machine is for algorithmic computing, right? And that is, Turing machines don't feel emotions. Turing machines don't make relationships. Turing machines don't grow in their environment over time. So we know what Turing machines are, and they're not the same as brains.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Here's one from the Q&A, which is basically pushing on, I think, a different aspect of your talk, saying, thanks for the insightful talk. There's a philosophy of science that says scientific research itself is in essence reductionist, so medical science deconstructs the human into organs and cells, and is asking, well, would you say this reductionist mechanistic philosophy shouldn't apply to studying humans? And I guess, would medical science be dehumanizing as well, or just the act of, I'm extrapolating from the question, the act of applying scientific study to humans be dehumanizing? What's different? Yeah.
Wow. I guess giving a talk like this leads to really interesting questions. I think medical science absolutely can be dehumanizing, right? If you think about experiments that were done on people without their consent, that was absolutely dehumanizing, right? And if you, like, the history of gynecology is a history of mutilation of black women, right? So yes, medical science can be dehumanizing. I think it can also be applied in a way where you hold space for the whole human and say, okay, we have an imperfect understanding that involves looking at smaller parts and smaller systems, and it seems to help these actual humans some of the time. And I think that sort of threads the needle and gets away with dehumanization. And similarly, when you're doing, cognitive science of any kind, we're going to be zooming in on specific things that people are doing and not necessarily studying the whole human all the time. And that's okay. I'm not saying don't do science. I'm saying don't mistake the bit that you're understanding well for the whole of the experience of the person in front of you.
Thanks. I apologize. I'm like really cold, so if I start shivering, it's just because of that. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about why you chose sort of humanization and this character of human, this category of humans as this sort of framing for all these different ideas that you're bringing together. Because in listening to your talk, I can't help but think, there are some humans that are really awful, and so being lumped in with them isn't so great. We're the same species, we're the same biological kind, but who cares? My dog is pretty great. I'm happy to be lumped in with her. And it speaks to this more general thing, which is, for me, in listening to you, I'm thinking, well, it's not so much being human per se as it is being, sort of worthy of moral respect. There are certain people who are worthy of moral respect, and when they're not given that respect, they are treated in a way that's inappropriate, and I think would glom on to a lot of the instances of dehumanization that you bring up. And I think it's important, sort of separating out, human, the biological category, from person, or sort of unit of moral respect, or whatever you want to talk about as that thing that matters here. Because, it's pretty easy to sort of say, oh, well, LLMs, clearly they're not humans, right? Are they worthy of moral respect? I don't think so right now, but it's a harder question than just the question of are they humans, and it will become a harder question. Because humans, a biological category, they're plainly not humans. But in thinking about whether they're worthy of moral respect, I think that gets into this more difficult question, but it's ultimately the question I think we have to answer of what is a thing that's worthy of moral respect, and it's the kind of question that's sort of brought to the fore in thinking about AI capabilities. So I wondered if you could just speak a little more to why you chose, humanity, being a human, as this sort of framing device for thinking about this, whole host of different things. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think to a certain extent it's because of that path that I took into the question. I also think that we see a lot of things going wrong in our present world that have to do with not according humanity to humans. So there are lots of people here who, by virtue of being humans, are deserving of moral respect. I mean, even reprehensible humans, we have a whole set of codes for how we handle prosecution, and we disapprove of cruel and unusual punishment and all of that. That has to do with according moral respect to even humans who we find despicable because they are humans. So there's a whole host of problems there, and I see this discourse about what about future AIs that are deserving of moral respect, how do we reason about that, as a distraction from the current urgent problems. And so this comes back to this question about AI safety similarly. There's a whole bunch of energy and resources, like literal millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars being put into these questions that are about a fantasy future and that distract from and sort of make noise around the real harms that are being done by these systems called AI now to actual humans. And I'm not trying to draw a line so much between humans and animals, because that's sort of a different set of questions, but there are actual, I think that there is a certain moral respect accorded to anyone who's human by virtue of being human, and that is we're failing at that right now, and a lot of the work on so-called AI safety and worrying about robots' rights and things like that is sort of a big distraction and drawing energy away from people who are being harmed now by these things that are called AI.
If I could just very quickly, I think that it might be that 100% of humans are worthy of certain levels of moral respect, but I wonder that maybe it's not because they're human in the species sense. And so that's why I worry about the dehumanization question, but talk about it more. Thank you.
All right, so I've got another from online, and I'm kind of lumping two together a bit because they're on similar themes, which is on the scientific communication aspect of this. So one of the questions is asking, how do you respond to basically the answer, the response that what you're doing is you're just trying to naysay people who are actually trying to solve, real problems, and this person says they've received that response a lot of times, and I guess and the other question I'm lumping into this is on Twitter especially, isn't it too short and like 140 characters, whatever? Can you really do good scientific communication in that kind of medium?
All right, more rich questions. What do I say to people who say I'm just, naysaying the work of people who are doing the real hard work of building machine learning or something? It's like, if you are claiming to solve problems, then you have to show me the people who understand the domain that those problems are coming from and their understanding of whether or not your solutions are valid. And too much of the work in computer science seems to be just all computer science internal with drawing on external fields as metaphors and motivation. So that's where I go with that one. As for whether Twitter can be effective, I think it can. So threads help. It's 280 characters now, not 140. But also a lot of Twitter is pointing to longer form things. And just one sort of thing about Twitter, if you want to get traction and you're doing a tweet thread, it's worth thinking about how to make each tweet something that would stand alone and possibly get retweeted. So yeah, there's something to learn there. I have seen it work sometimes. I've also seen stuff that's impenetrable, and so I don't finish reading the tweet thread. But I guess part of my confidence that it works is that I have learned from Twitter about fields outside of my own, and so I think it's possible.
So we have 1 minute left, so I'll go with the front person here. Sorry for the rest of you, but you can grab Emily after the talk. Go ahead.
All right. So years ago at the AAAI town hall, you were talking about distribution of funds, and that could encourage the right direction. And we were talking about the future of AI, and I mentioned that one of the problems is about distributing funds across universities, not just going by prestige. You know, like there's a couple of those Ivy League schools that's where most of the money goes to, and usually review process is kind of biased in that. So I wanted to hear your comment on perhaps combating that, because that could exclude, for example, lots of good work and research, even in communities that are more grounded, and actually could offer some things that help, for example, against fighting against dehumanization. And then the last component, I'll just lump it in here too, is the peer review process. I think that there's a lot of an old boys club where there's a lot of you kind of look up on archives, especially in computer science, and I'm going to pick on one of my old home fields, machine learning, where they look at where you come from, are you part of this very particular famous lab, and sorry, your work might be valid and meritorious, but it doesn't matter. And so that same narrow viewpoint kind of creates like these simplified tasks, and a lot of like GPT-3 being the solution to all of artificial intelligence. I wanted to hear your comment about reformation and how the role that might play. I'm not asking for solutions because it's super hard, but how those play a role, because I feel like that's creating a lot of this dehumanization research where you have a few thinkers and a lot of good work is kind of being pushed out of these main venues that people herald as like, this is the place that AI research and machine learning research gets done.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I think that there is a role for, you know, when you find yourself in a position of power, like if you get invited to take on that role at a national funding agency, you know, consider doing it and consider, okay, what can I do with this? How can I reshape things? What are the questions that I can ask the reviewers that valorize the things that I care about, right? Could a point in the review be, to what extent does this proposal, this funding proposal, bring in new ideas, new viewpoints that are not yet well represented, right? And I mean, we see this already in the US NSF, where there's some emphasis on, is this broadening participation? Is this funding going to help bring more people into the field? And that will help, you know, universities that are less likely to be the ones collecting all the research funds. So I think there's stuff that we can do. It's going to be slow. And the other thing is that, you know, as a co-reviewer, you don't have to be the one designing the review form. If you see somebody else on the panel doing the thing, you can point it out and you say, this is not okay, this is bad for the field.
Yeah, thank you.
That's actually a very nice note to end on, so thank you, Emily, again. And I'll send you all the questions in the chat as well. So yeah, everyone, Emily Bender, thank you.